Hello everybody, good morning. I'd like to call you all to attention, please. Take a seat. Well done for getting here on Saturday morning at 9:35. And thank you very much. Some of you have come very long distances to be with us today. And while it's never a burden to come to Oxford in the springtime, we are grateful all the same. My name is Cameron Hepburn, and I'm Professor of Environmental Economics here at the University, at the Smith School and Institute for New Economic Thinking. And I am, I have to admit, really a mere figurehead for today's conference. There is a fantastic organising team that has been the engine of the work today, led ably here by Rebecca. And so it's to them that the thanks must go at the end, perhaps not at the start, but certainly at the end. Looking a little bit nervous there. But there are a few more important topics for us as a community to tackle together than climate change. I was just discussing with Forbes over there, who said it's never too late to do the right thing, and we are definitely doing the right thing here by getting the collective capabilities of the Rhodes Scholarship, the Rhodes Network, together to tackle what is perhaps the problem of this generation. Now, the conference topic, Generation 1.5, can be read either optimistically or pessimistically. At 1.5 degrees, we still have a fairly substantial level of climate impacts. But on the other hand, any of us working in this space, as I suspect you all are, would probably agree with me that 1.5 degrees is a fairly optimistic target. Not unachievable, but it's an ambitious one all the same. And that's why meeting that kind of target demands the best that the world has to offer, and some of the best that the world has to offer is in this room and in our network, and we need to get on the case. So today is a great continuation in Rhodes Scholar efforts in this area, and hopefully a force for bringing us all together. Now I want to say a few quick remarks about the content before, just to kick off the day and frame some of the ideas before we get into the logistics and get into the business of the day. Now, firstly, I think we have to acknowledge that we don't start from a brilliant position on climate change. I think we're probably aware of that. We've had 20, 30, depending on where you measure from, 40 years of relative inaction on what is perhaps the world's most pressing issue. It's not a great legacy from certainly the generation ahead and what is increasingly now my generation to leave your generation. But equally, we have some momentum, notwithstanding the events of last year, that we've never had before in this space. It's not just the Paris Agreement. It's not just the serious and really deep engagement of the private sector in this issue now. It's also the pace of technological progress that is threatening to give us the chance of success in this issue. I mean, the people I talk to who work on this and have been working on it for 20, 30 years, as I have 20 years, feel like we're at a moment now where some kind of success is now within our grasp. And that is extremely exciting. But it's also very worrying because we are basically out of time. The most cited piece of work our group at Oxford did last year was a piece of analysis showing that for a 2-degree budget, not 1.5, even to get to 2 degrees, once you take into account the emissions that are baked into the existing capital stock around the world, we're there. We hit it this year. 2017 is the year at which we breached 2 degrees of embodied emissions in the world's capital stock. Now, the implication of that is that either every single investment from this year onwards needs to be zero carbon. That's every bit of power, every bit of cement industry, glass industry, you name it. Or, and it's not going to be, right, because we have several hundred gigawatts of coal fire power coming down the pipeline. Or we are in the business of stranding assets, wiping them out, and or pushing technological progress to capture and or negate negative emissions technologies in order to square the circle and get to 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. And we obviously need to push as hard as we have been doing, continue to push on renewables so that we don't add more of the dirty kit that we then need to strand. So this is a huge challenge. I think you know that. It's not just scientific, it's not just economic, it's not just political, it's not just social. It's all of those things and several more, actually, and that's why it requires this community to come together, and that's why we've got such an exciting program for the next 2 days. And I think it's a credit to the real organisers of this conference that on a weekend we have so many talented people for 2 whole days. And I don't want to go through the program with you because you have it here in front of you. But it is entirely appropriate that we're not just having people like me speaking to you today, that we have people from across the spectrum of the business, the artistic, the political landscape, because they're the skills and the mix of experiences that are going to be required for us to win here. So that's really all I wanted to say. I hope we can have a very open dialogue, a very engaged, honest dialogue, one which challenges. You don't let things go by that you think are not soundly based or evidence-based, but one which makes some progress. And we'll have a discussion that I'm very much looking forward to tomorrow about how we take the notion of a really vibrant Rhodes Scholar network on climate change forward. So we have chapters in different parts of the world and work streams where we contribute. Many of us are at these international meetings without necessarily knowing that the people that we're talking to are Rhodes Scholars. I had no idea until this conference that John Room, who heads up climate in the World Bank, who would love to have been here, was a Rhodes Scholar. It's just one of these things. You operate without realizing the extent of your shared heritage. So we can and should do better there. So that's it from me, other than, at least, well, I'll be back, sorry. But for the moment, I wanted to introduce Rebecca to take us through some of the logistics of the day before I come and introduce Claire. Thank you.
Thanks, Cameron. And on behalf of the organising committee, I just really want to thank everyone for being here today. We're really glad to see you, and we hope that you're looking forward to a weekend of learning and sharing ideas on what, as Cameron mentioned, really is the defining problem of our generation. I just want to run through some logistical information to start the day off, just so that we all know what's happening throughout the rest of the weekend. So you'll all have noticed that on your badge you have either an A or a B, and that's your allocation for the breakout group sessions. So if you're in Group A, that means that you'll be starting off with Kathy in the Roseberry room, which is to the left as you exit the hall and then up the stairs. And if you're in Group B, you'll be starting off in Akram's workshop in the Bite room, which is through where we had food earlier and then to the left. And if you're new to Rhodes House also, just so that you know, the toilets are across the entry hall and then down the stairs. Throughout the weekend, we'll be having our morning teas and afternoon teas in the Jameson room, the same place where we got breakfast from this morning. And both today and tomorrow, we also have lunchtime discussions. So lunch will be served in the Jameson room, but we'll ask you to grab your lunch relatively quickly and then come and take a seat here in Milner Hall so that we can start those discussions and then have a little bit of, today particularly, have a little bit of sort of free discussion time afterwards as well. We also have a mentoring session tomorrow afternoon, so that's a really great opportunity for you guys to chat one-on-one with some of our speakers and our senior scholars. So during the weekend, or during today, we'll ask you to sign up for a mentor slot. We ask you to just put your name down for one slot first, and then if there are more spaces, we'll open it up again tomorrow. And you can do that just by writing your name in a slot on the whiteboard at the back of the room where all of our mentors are listed. Tonight we'll be having a drinks reception, followed by a dinner here, and then we'll be heading off to King's Arms afterwards for a bit to carry on the conversation in a more informal atmosphere. Tomorrow morning we're also trying to really sort of break down the barriers between, from a formal conference style to a more informal, intimate workshop, and we're starting off with a walk or a run in the morning, where Varun, one of our alumni, will be heading off a run, and we're hoping that as many people, including our senior scholars, can join us for that as possible. So I just wanted to remind you that this weekend isn't designed to be a typical conference. It's meant to be an intimate and informal workshop where we can really share ideas, and as Cameron said, don't be afraid to question things that you hear, and don't be afraid to speak up and share your ideas as well, because really the advantage of this community is that we come from so many different backgrounds, and we really want to build on that advantage. So I hope you enjoy the weekend, and yeah, we're looking forward to the rest of the sessions today, and I'll hand back over to Cameron.
Thanks, Rebecca. And let me reiterate what a great job the organising committee have done. So now we start the day with a couple of scene-setting talks, discussions, presentations. And the first of those is from Claire Shakya from the IIED. Claire is director of the climate change group there and has had really a vast amount of experience and has a vast amount of expertise in this space. Before the IAD, she spent 15 years at DFID, working on climate from an African and an Asian perspective. And she's been thinking very hard about how to meet the broader set of challenges in the Sustainable Development Goals in a 1.5 degree world. And Claire, we need to have a chat afterwards about some of the trade-offs and challenges in meeting all of those SDGs. But these are vital questions, and we are delighted, Claire, that you have come to share your thoughts with us today. So please join me in welcoming Claire. Thank you.
Thanks, Cameron. So, yeah, I've been working on these areas for far too long now, and I've spent most of my time having a discussion about what the trade-offs are, Cameron. So hopefully I'm going to answer that there are no trade-offs, actually. There is only one way of going, and that's tackling both poverty and climate change at the same time. So we've got a picture up here of the storms down in Cornwall, with the Ethiopian drought. That photo's from just a few days ago from the news report. And then, of course, we've got Trump. So things are pretty live right now in the climate change world. I just got a message this morning that the World Bank has said that they're stepping up. With the UK and the US going in the wrong direction at the moment, climate finance is going to be short. We need the finance to fund the action. The World Bank's going to step up. So that sounds great, doesn't it? Well, okay, now I'm going to tell you why we need to actually completely reform the way that action is taken, not just by the big organisations like the bank working and investing in climate change, but also by us, by everybody. So let's start with the challenge. First of all, I'm assuming that we don't all know everything there is to know about climate change, so I just thought I'd just introduce very quickly the basic concepts. Why do we mind that it's getting warmer? Why are we worrying about global warming? Well, first of all, when people are talking about climate change, they're talking about climate that's different from weather. It's not what's happening outside your window. It's how the whole system of weather operates, and it's very chaotic. But when people are talking about a 1.5 degree rise, they're talking about an average climate across the globe, which actually means very different things in different places and creates much greater energy within the climate system, so you get a lot more extreme events. When we're talking about, a lot of people talk about the uncertainty. There isn't really that much uncertainty. We know it's changing. What we don't know is exactly what day it's going to do what in what place, but then we don't know that about weather. We don't know that also about foreign exchange markets. We don't know that about what the interest rate's going to be next year. There's a lot of things around which we have uncertainty. We don't stop taking action just because we don't know what rate our bank is going to give us in our savings account next year, do we? We continue to do things. So there's no reason, just because we don't know precisely what climate change impact is going to be happening, precisely in what location, not to be taking action. So we've got four tribes in the climate change, thinking about climate change. There's the deniers. They're easy to spot. They say it's just not happening. This is just normal. This is no change. They're getting fewer, thank goodness. We've got the skeptics, and this is actually, in some ways, what I've spent most of my life working with, who say climate's not so sensitive, and actually really what we should be worrying about right now is poverty. We should be worrying about growth. We should be getting jobs available. So let's get our priorities right. They're also more and more persuaded these days. The biggest concern I have is around the incrementalists, that actually it's okay, it's all going in the right direction, technology will get us there, economics will eventually prevail. What we need to do is radically change the way that society operates. And the incrementalists are on our side, but we need to move them into what types of radical change is needed. And then we got the radicals. I think by the fact that I'm even saying radical change, you probably guess where I sit. Society basically fundamentally needs to change if we're going to deliver the 10% year-on-year reduction from last year. We haven't done it yet. It had to start happening from last year, as Cameron says, and we haven't started. The politics of emissions. Everyone talks about the emissions as targets by a certain date that they'll peak, or by a certain date that they'll reduce their intensity of their emissions, or by a certain date that they'll be on net carbon, zero net carbon. That's all noise in the system. What really matters is what's happening to the carbon budget. So I hope to be able, just one more thing, just to be sure that we're all on the same page. Climate change is happening. 97% agreement. There's as much certainty about climate change as there is about smoking causing cancer. Now, the reality is, I say this all the time, I actually do smoke on occasion. Now, so it's about behaviour change. It's very difficult to get whole societies to change. It's uncomfortable to keep talking about what we personally need to do. But if you were planning to fly somewhere for a holiday, think about climate change, because flights, our holidays, are probably the biggest thing that you do that is affecting climate change. It's all about lifestyles, and we have to change our lifestyles. It's not so bad to live at 2 tons per capita. I try to do it. I don't do it for work because I do have to fly for that, but I don't fly anywhere for a holiday. I go by train, or I bike, or I get in the car with the family, making sure we've got the car nicely efficient and doing travelling as low consumption of energy as possible. But it's all about consuming, it's all about our lifestyle. And in the UK and in the richer countries, it's a lot about the stock of capital that we have in our housing and our buildings that are just so inefficient, and that's not easy to change. So there are huge things to change that aren't easy to change, and this is why we should be panicking. So back in 2011, lots and lots of work was done with scientists working hard and agreeing basically that in 2011 we had a carbon budget of about 1,000 billion tonnes, which sounds great, doesn't it? Except what's happened since 2011, this is where we are today. All of that has just disappeared in just a few years. And to achieve 2 degrees, we have until 2033 to get to net zero carbon. For 1.5, what you guys are trying to do, we've got 5 years. 5 years, that's all we've got. So this isn't a conversation that just people like me should be having anymore. This is a conversation that everyone should be having. How do we change society so we can achieve 1.5? So another way of looking at this, I've got to get this carbon budget idea across, so I'm slightly pausing on it. But staying below 1.5, this is basically, you've got 4 to 13 years, but our best estimate is 2021. Staying below 2. Now, to be fair, to be equitable in the world, what we need to do is the rich countries need to get to zero net carbon faster. So they need to do it by 2035, which would allow the poorer countries to do it by 2050. So, just to emphasise the equity issue again, everyone's been emitting carbons in different ways. Basically, the UK was one of the first with the Industrial Revolution to be really emitting large amounts, and then everyone's been catching up and overtaking. The poorest countries are up here. They hardly emit anything. And the other thing to note is that 10%, that's 1 in 10 people, are emitting half of the emissions. So 1 in 10 people, in fact, we don't have to worry about the 90% right now. We just have to worry about the 10%. But who are the 10%? They're people like us. They're educated people who are flying around the world and consuming lots of stuff. I'm not sure how well this is showing, really, but just to say, basically, to go back to that point, if you hear people talking about a percentage of rise globally, then that has very different impacts in different places. And even in Europe, there's going to be really big increases in heat waves, for example. Now, when we have heat waves, lots of older people die. When we have heat waves in Europe, we have problems with our energy because France, for example, if they don't have enough water, they can't cool their nuclear power. They have to turn them all off. That's happened a few times. So it's not just about the rest of the world, what's happening, and the impacts will be very severe different impacts will be very severe in different places. It is all quite complex, but basically it depends on how, even if Europe has huge heat waves, basically, it has lots of ways of cooling, lots of ways of responding. And so fundamentally, you start thinking about where's the adaptive capacity, where can people cope best? So you take the impacts and then you say, okay, so who can cope with this type of impact? And you find that actually, it's the very poorest countries that are going to struggle most. But remember, they're not emitting anything. They're the ones that are going to get the impact, but they're not emitting. It's us that's emitting, and we're able to cope. Now, coming back to this sort of trade-off issue, everyone has spent years talking about, get your priorities right. Climate change is a problem for tomorrow. Let's reduce poverty today. Let's tackle our social problems in our own countries and the countries elsewhere. Well, finally, in Paris, we pretty much reached consensus, and very much helped by the World Bank finally taking a position on this, that actually poverty and climate change is linked. You can't reduce poverty without tackling climate change. Their Shockwaves report was the seminal piece that finally sort of put them on the map talking about this. And what they're able to show in this is something that we've all known for a long time. Poor people live in places where there's a lot of climate variability. If you're living somewhere with lots and lots of drought, you're generally poorer than somewhere where there isn't so much drought. If you're living somewhere where there's lots of floods, it's actually quite interesting because floods bring alluvial silt and actually improve your fields. You're not necessarily going to be poorer, but in the urban areas you are poor. If you're the poor person, you're living where it floods. In the rural areas, it's not quite so clear-cut. But basically what you can show is that the poor lose more of their income with every shock, and the only way to tackle poverty is for rapid, inclusive, and climate-informed development. And you need to mitigate as well, because otherwise you've got more impacts that are going to come down the road and make it even harder to reduce poverty. So finally we can say, to end poverty, you need to stabilise climate. Both are essential to sustainable development. You can't isolate them. You have to look at this together. So the sweet spot, the triple win, is what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to mitigate against climate change. We're trying to adapt against the existing climate change that's already in the system that we can't do anything about. And we're also trying to achieve poverty reduction and social justice. So how are we doing? We got the Paris Agreement. It was fabulous. I cried. I couldn't believe it. Everyone's standing up and saying, yes, we agree. And not only were they agreeing to the 2-degree target, they were agreeing to 1.5 being the ultimate aim. Now, that's important because there's a lot of countries in the world which will stop existing if we go above 1.5. The small island states, there's large numbers of them that will just not be viable as countries anymore. Has anyone ever been to some of these places will know, a lot of them, literally, there's just no height to them at all. Really small islands, and they're only 1 metre above sea level now. So Paris was made up of what climate change world love jargon, so I'm afraid this is a bit of a journey of jargon. The intended nationally determined contributions were what they were called in the run-up to Paris. Now they're agreed, they're the NDCs, they're nationally determined contributions. Every country decided that they would do something, and then they said what they'd do. Climate Action Tracker's view of how everyone did, well, basically Europe's in yellow. They're doing okay, but not brilliant. China and Canada in red. This was obviously before Truman and Trump. But Ethiopia, Morocco are doing much better. So the poorest countries are often the ones that are being prepared to take more action. I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but this is just to give you, in one slide, the problem. Basically, every single NDC was slightly different. Every single NDC had a different time frame. They had different mitigation targets. Even for somebody like me, who is steeped in the language of climate change, it was hard to compare between 2 NDCs. A lot of them covered adaptation action, but basically they were just stating, we want to do everything, it's all going to be fine. A lot of the poorest countries' actions that they said they'd take was conditional on climate finance arriving. So it's really important that climate finance happens because otherwise the action won't happen. The LDCs as a group agreed that their negotiation strategy was to lead from the front, to show them what was possible. Sorry, the LDCs, again, climate jargon. The least developed countries, the 48 poorest countries, all come together into one negotiating bloc, and they're the climate leaders in the climate world. So they agreed as a bloc that they would get their NDCs really high in ambition and get them in early to maintain moral high ground. Well, one of them managed it, Ethiopia. They got theirs in really early. They got a green light from the Climate Action Tracker. But it's really hard for these poorest countries because they don't have very much capacity. They don't have very large governments. And one person will be running around doing a lot of different things. Trying to get these things done in time and was difficult. So this is just part of the problem. Even the ones that want to be ambitious struggle to get their plans together. Now, the theory of change in the Paris Agreement, basically, there is no commitments that are binding, except that everyone will report. Everyone will say what they're planning to do and then report on whether they've done it or not. That's basically the theory of change. Now, that, therefore, all relies on us, general public, caring. So the basic story goes, a country develops its action plan, their NDC, they commit to act, and they measure, they report back. As we, the public, begin to have concerns about climate change, we put pressure on our government, force them to do more, and then they increase their ambition. That's the idea. So so how did we do? Well, this Paris theory of change, what happened? We got an agreement. This is the first time we've had a universal agreement. Every country's agreed, climate change is a problem, we're going to act. Copenhagen didn't work, so this is obviously a better approach. There's already evidence since Paris that things are moving. That things, for example, on aviation emissions, on how those get measured and reported and discussed have started in a way that we hadn't seen prior to Paris. But it does assume that the public care, it does assume that the governments respond to public peer pressure, and we haven't got anything like what we need. So the really important thing is the next 2 years, that within Paris, there's a rule book agreed that forces everyone to start to measure in a similar way and allow people to actually understand what governments are saying they'll do so that we can say it's not enough. And at the moment, the glass is only third full. So what the NDCs all added up to was a sort of greenhouse gas emissions continuing to increase. And what we need to do is the lower line, the bridge scenario. Now, Irina, the sort of big international energy analysts have worked out that this set of things, that it is possible, they think, to achieve the reduction needed for gosh, this is 1.5, I think. I'm now trying to remember which scenario this is. But anyway, but when you're shown a graph like this, it all looks very easy, doesn't it? You've just got to do a bit more energy efficiency, reduce the amount of inefficient coal we do, invest a bit more in renewables, do something about methane, get rid of fossil fuel subsidies. Doesn't sound too hard. Boy, is that hard. That is about changing the nature of how we all live. It's about all of us turning down the heat at home so our rooms aren't so warm. It's about putting in more insulation. It's about changing the way you drive. It's about a lot of things. It's about individuals changing, and that is difficult to do. So, this is trying to tell you what needs to happen. We need to get all the countries, this is the rule book that needs to happen for Paris. At the moment, where we are is over here. You can't see, nobody knows what's going on, nobody understands what countries are saying they're going to do, you can't understand it. Everyone's got a slightly different time frame about when they're going to update their NDCs. What we need is everyone agreeing that every 5 years they will set out in stone what they're going to do over the next 5 years, and for the following 5 years they need to say what they hope to do. And then the public needs to jump up and down and say, that's not enough, we want more, do more now. And it needs to also focus not on everyone. There's an awful lot of the development world which is around sort of saying, look, I did it, I promise, look, here's the statistics. It's got to be much less around, you've done it, much more around, what did you do that worked best? How did you change your society and your country to suddenly take action and start changing how they lived? So we've really got to focus the conversation about what works, what makes a difference. So that was all the big enough challenge, and then 2016 happened. I'm very much a glass half full person, so I'm going to take you through the events of 2016 from the glass half full perspective. There is, of course, the glass half empty perspective, which I'm sure others will cover. First of all, we have Brexit. Now, Brexit's really, really bad news for climate change, because the UK had been one of the leading countries they were the first country to put in place a Climate Change Act that committed them to a level of emission reductions. And they had forced ambition into the rest of Europe. Through the UK working with Germany and France, we got Paris. It was the three of them working, persuading Poland to move, persuading some of the other countries to do things, and basically using every diplomatic tool they had in the box. They were determined. Everyone was on the case. Well, Germany, France, and the UK really pushed Europe. And because Europe went more ambitious, that really pushed the rest of the world. So what's happening with Brexit? Well, if the UK leaves the EU climate negotiation bloc, will France and Germany still be able to persuade Poland and Turkey and the surrounding countries? It's not just Europe, it's the surrounding countries as well that they were influencing. Can they still persuade them? We don't know. But the good news is, when Theresa May is endlessly talking about global Britain, what does global Britain mean to the rest of the world? It means that the UK continues to take climate action, because that is what we have developed a reputation for. So we're hopeful that, even with the geopolitics and the changes, the other thing that's good is that the UK is fundamentally reliant on being part of the EU energy pool. The way that we've developed our energy over the last 10, 15, 20 years is all reliant on us being able to transmit and share energy with the rest of Europe. And that's how the energy system works most efficiently. It's how you can bring more renewables in. We've got too much wind in the UK to cope with it on our own. When we have a lot of wind, we have to send it off to Europe. When Europe has a lot of wind, they send it to us. It's how the energy system works. And it's how you keep the grid stable. We have to be part of it. So hopefully that means we'll also potentially be part of the climate story there. Trump. So Trump's using up all his energy, trying to decide whether or not he's going to be in Paris. And for weeks, since he was elected, we've been told on a Friday to be ready with our statement for when Trump says he's going to leave Paris. And actually, our statement will say, if he ever does get round to saying he's going to leave Paris, is we don't care. We don't think that the federal government of the US is going to hurt global climate negotiations or global action, particularly because actually there were so few levers in the federal government. That's why Obama managed to do so little, because it's really about state action and it's really about businesses. And right now, the economics of coal are looking pretty poor. He wants to reopen coal. Actually, most of the places around the world right now are doing auctions on energy, are finding that coal comes in as more expensive than wind or solar. So I don't think he's going to win this one, but let's see. As I say, I'm a glass half full person. I talked before about the least developed countries. They say, we're going to carry on. It doesn't matter what the rest of the world does. We are going to set a very high, ambitious direction. And the great thing about the poorest countries of the world is that China and India don't like being told that they are not part of that group. They don't like being told that they're not doing enough by the poorest countries, because they see themselves as countries with huge numbers of poor people, which indeed they are. They want to be part of the club of the poorest countries. So in order to do that, they're going to have to take action. We hope this is, again, very much the glass half full story. The Climate Vulnerable Forum, of whom many of them those countries are the least developed countries, have already committed to achieve 100% renewable energy by 2050, i.e. consistent with what's needed for 2 degrees, not quite consistent with what's needed for 1.5. Big business. We mean business, the renewable energy 100, there are hundreds of different, I really don't know what Unilever does apart from go around to different events with big business, different factions all saying great things on climate. They are moving, and they are moving really fast. IKEA, big companies are saying we are going to act, and we're going to act fast. What they haven't yet said is when they're going to, that they don't all have the same dates. They're a bit like the NDCs. Everyone's doing something slightly different. Subnational governments, very exciting. This is actually where I think things really will begin to change, because I think your local government is the one that you see more often. That your local government is where you directly get services from. They are signing up to climate action. In large numbers, there's a thing called the Under 2 MOU, which is now 35% of the economy, 1 billion people. California is one of the starting countries, Quebec, Scotland. There's a number of very active subnational governments that are doing great things. South Australia. So it kind of doesn't matter what some of the big governments are doing if the subnational governments are deciding to take action. So that's all great on the emissions side. What's not so great is that you need climate finance to get to the poorest countries who can't afford to take action without help. And all of these things that have happened, Brexit, Trump and so on, will probably mean we'll have less climate finance available. The bank's just said that they're going to step up, but the bank only does certain types of investments. So, how are we doing on social justice and climate change? I've done a lot of political economy analysis, and really the simplest way of looking at things is follow the money. Find out where the money's going, and you begin to understand what the politics of action are. So first of all, the rich countries of the world have said that they're going to give $100 billion every year on climate action. Since they started talking about climate finance, they have committed a total of 35.3 billion. Sorry, this is last year's statistics. 35.3 billion, and that sounds great, doesn't it? Except, actually, only 8% has left their account so far. 8%. So they're talking great things, but spending the money the money's just not flowing. And the poor countries know that. The rich countries say, but we've done all of this, we've done that, we've done that. And the poor countries are saying, but we don't see it. Where is it? There's also a very fundamental problem that the 100 billion sounds great, except if you just take the poorest countries, just the NDCs of the 48 poorest countries, they basically need 100 billion all by themselves. And if you just take one simple issue, energy access, this is how much is currently allocated, and this is how much is needed. We've got quite a long way to go on getting the finance flowing at the levels that's needed. But then the other issue is which countries get it. So the poorest countries, very small governments, one person running around doing the job of 300 people in another government, really struggle to get money in the door because they don't have time to do all the things that are needed. Only 5% of the energy finance committed to date has reached the poorest countries. That's 5%. Those poorest countries represent half the people globally who don't have access to any energy at the moment. So we've got half the people, no access to energy, 5% of the finance is going there. And then if you look at the types of energy systems that are being invested in, it's great to have grid electricity, that's what we have. We can turn the lights on and off at the door. If you're in a very poor country, you're probably quite far from where the nearest grid is. The easiest way to get you energy access is off-grid. That's how we'll reach the billions without access to energy at the moment. But only 9% is being invested into that type of energy. If you take adaptation finance, it's just as bad. It's a much smaller flow. And even though it's meant to be for the very poorest countries, only 40% is going to the poor countries. So we've got to change the way, I'm going to speed up, I've only got 10 minutes left. If you look at how climate finance flows also down to the local level, to where people are actually living and taking action, we think, and this is a very rough estimate because the donor statistics is so poor and so difficult to analyse, but we think it's only 10% is actually dedicated to reach communities, to reach the poor people themselves to take action. And that's because the finance arrives already committed for a particular purpose, and there's no voice, not by the national government nor by communities, actually deciding what can be done. So I'm going to take you quickly through a very fast tour of what we think we need to do. First of all, the accountability architecture. I've talked about this a lot. we need to change the way that the entire Paris is governed so that we get ambition building, timing, aligning the timing of updates, covering the same periods, and meaningful transparency, meaning we can actually, when we read what a government says it's doing, we can understand what they've said they're doing. If we can understand it, we can say it's not enough. If we can't understand it, it's very hard to complain. We also need to set up multi-stakeholder climate change committees. It sounds very boring, it's development jargon, but basically it means we need to bring a much wider group of society together at every level, national level and local level, globally in every country, so that we can actually agree what the priorities for action are as a group and make sure that women, youth and other excluded groups are part of that decision-making process. And we need to make sure that finance flows down in ways that give people the chance to say, we want to use it for this, and not that. So that's that again. It's the same story, but just at all these different levels. The other thing we need to do is to start to tackle vulnerability in ways that are far-reaching, i.e. we can reach large numbers of people. A lot of the really good work that's happening at the moment are all small, gold-plated projects that are brilliant, but will never reach everyone at that level. So we need to go just for the things that are going to have the biggest impact, both in terms of the numbers of people we reach, but also in terms of looking long-term and thinking through what might happen in that geography and that climate in the next 20 years. How do we tackle vulnerability that will still be a sensible thing to do in 20 years? And make sure that it's socially just so that everyone has a voice. Now, there's a whole set of things there I won't go into. Just know there's lots of good work that's being done in development that fits this bill. So let's do more of that. We need to transform energy systems. Again, I think it's too light for you to see this. This is a map of the world. The bit you can see at the top with all the lights on is Europe. Everywhere else is pretty dark. That's the developing countries. We need to transform energy systems really quickly, but there are lots of good things happening. Again, Cameron mentioned this earlier, falling technology costs, the way that auctions are happening. It's just incredible how fast energy systems can transform, but they have to transform really fast. Biggest challenges are around appliance efficiency, so everything that we're using is as efficient as possible. The challenge there is not that we haven't got more efficient appliances, it's that people are still using their old ones that are inefficient. So we need to find a way of persuading people to move on to the more efficient appliances. Distributed grids, smart grids, there's all sorts of really exciting things happening in the way that grids are managed and we can transform. We keep talking about this leapfrog into this new world of energy systems, but there are two things that aren't happening. One is smart grids, where you automate the way the grid is run. We talk about it a lot. The UK is one of the great innovators in smart grid, but nobody's actually running a smart grid yet. Nobody's actually done it yet. But there are really great, exciting things happening in the developing world as well, where you have things like pay-as-you-go energy systems. So you basically pay for the energy you use. And the main thing is, when we're thinking about transforming energy systems, it shouldn't be experts flying in from outside the country. You need to work with the people in the country so that they can actually deliver the plans. So what developing world has done to date, or the development group, basically you have people like myself and experts sent in to give country a plan. We can't do that anymore. If you're going to transform societies, you need to do it with the people in the country. You need to change the way we operate. So I'm really going to rush through now, not tell you anything about that. And not really, well, there's some good signs. That whole ambition mechanism that I was talking about earlier, there are things that are beginning to happen. So that's good. We're just not doing them fast enough. Some really exciting work that's been, that IIED's involved in 4 countries, all supported actually with UK finance at the moment, but about to be supported by Sweden, and we're beginning to see more countries doing it, is a process of getting the climate finance all the way from the global level down to local levels and saying to poor people, what do you think you should be doing? What's your priority to reduce vulnerability and to move into a low emission world? And they are making choices that are already having impacts. So this year, big drought happening in Africa, you may have heard about it. Where is it not proving a problem? Where are cattle still got enough grazing and enough water to drink? It's in the places we've been doing this work. in Isiolo, in Wajir, in Garissa. It's very exciting. We are proving that if the finance gets to the right place, poor people are given the opportunity to make decisions about what they think is the most important. It reduces their vulnerability, it reduces their poverty, and it changes the way that that small society works. So I won't go into this, but basically the main investments they're making is in rehabilitation of water infrastructure. But the really exciting thing is that the institutions they're setting up to manage this money are then forming reciprocal agreements with neighbouring institutions and agreeing that cattle can move or they'll help each other at times of drought. And it's that sort of collective action, bottom-up action, that's really making the biggest difference. So this is, again, just explaining how this whole process works. Finance flowing is the most important thing, but it's what the institutions and how they operate that changing that is the important bit of it. This is basically a slide just saying if the development world just got their act together, it's really not rocket science to reduce risk for poor people, but you need to align everything in the same place. So lots of people are doing social protection, it's called, it's welfare type payments, cash transfers to the very poorest people. If only that could be increased at a time of drought or in time of flood. I mean, that's a good idea, right? Well, in 4 countries, we're working on it. It's not simple, and it really should be. Just bringing the humanitarian, development and climate people all into the same room and saying, what are you doing about risk? How can we bring it together so it all works for these communities? So in conclusion, basically in IID, we've got 4 straplines at the moment about how to change the world. One, achieve Paris ambition, we need this accountability mechanism. We need to learn fast about what works and make sure that that's the purpose of accountability. Secondly, we need to bring all the risk approaches that are being used in different places all together so that they actually work effectively as a set of tools that reduce risk for poorest people, for small enterprise, etc. The third area is money where it matters. Let's get the finance to where it matters. I'm finishing now. And the fourth area is ending fly-in, fly-out TA. This is the practice of development world solving other countries' problems by sending an expert in for a week or 2. It's not going to work. We've tried it for too many years. What we really need to do now is make long-term investments in the capabilities of the poorest countries so they can tackle this in ways that make sense to them. Thank you.
Great. But I'm expecting a vibrant set of discussion here. So please let me see some hands, or else I'm going to hit fail with some of my notes. Let's start there.
Hi, my name is Bernard Subri. Thank you for the presentation. I want to touch on the point of ending fly-in, fly-outs. What's your ideal plan? You talked about reducing personal flights and kind of the idea of a personal carbon budget. But institutionally, given that flights and transport in general internationally aren't really talked about in negotiations, what's your ideal devolution plan for flights or the IIEDs in terms of reducing that kind of source of emissions?
I mean, I've only been in IIED 9 months, so a lot of what I'll just say is not my brilliance, it's other people's. But basically, they, back in, when was it, 2010, said that they would reduce their emissions by the level that everyone has to reduce their emissions, so 10% year on year, and they're doing it. We do fly a lot. Climate negotiators are probably the worst in the whole of IIED in terms of how much my team that work on climate negotiations are flying the whole time. They do travel by train when they can, but it is a problem of negotiations, is that you are endlessly going to meetings in different places to negotiate. I would love to have found a solution to that, but you can't have corridor conversations and sneaky conversations in a video conference in the way that you can pass someone a message under the table in a room. And so negotiations don't work by video conference, basically. But in terms of how we work, instead of us, IIED, having offices all over the world, what we do is work with partners. What we do is have a partner in Kenya who we're working with, supporting over the long term their ability to deliver and do the research and do the understanding and do the technical analysis that's needed that government then relies on. In Tanzania, in Nepal, in Bangladesh, we have local partners who we're working with. We still have to go out and visit them, but we do try as much as we can to be investing in the institutions in the country, and then we don't have to fly. I pick up the phone to my mate Victor in Kenya and say, how's it going? You know, it's a very different way of doing business.
So can I abuse my position here and piggyback on that question to ask you another one? I'm probably the person in the room who's emitted the most in the last 24 hours, having flown myself and 5 others from Australia, arriving in here at 6 this morning. And I think the point about, travelling by train a bit here and there, I mean, come on. You've got to face the fact, I face the fact that I'm a big emitter. And for me, and I suspect for a lot of us in this room and for a lot of the climate negotiators, getting that to zero is about the technology to negate it. It's the negative emission side. It's about technological change in aviation. This is a challenge to you, Claire.
Yeah.
Where is the answer otherwise? Because I'm not going to skip my sister's wedding and my brother's wedding or attend it on Skype, frankly.
Okay. Well, Kevin Anderson is one of my favourite climate scientists because he literally does not fly anywhere. When I asked him to go and work with the Chinese government, he said, sure, and he took a train. It took him a week and a half. He got there. He hasn't been back.
Not all of us are going to be Kevin.
No, not all of us are Kevin. I mean, it does require us to make personal choices that are difficult. It does mean that we're not going to every wedding and every friend's party or whatever. And that is a choice that I've made. I've made that choice. On the work side, it is harder, and I agree. There is, so negative emissions, that's where I'd really like to pause, if you don't mind. There are all these ideas about how we can reduce carbon, take it out of the atmosphere. They've been around for a while. Carbon capture and storage was the first of them, and I was working in the UK government when we were trying to work with China and other places. We've never got to a point where anywhere is it happening. So these are great ideas, and when they start to happen, I'll be quite happy about many of them. I think we have to be really sure that the governance of the approaches that we use are sensible. If we start to talk about, there's a lot of people are talking about changing the way that solar radiation happens. So basically throwing stuff up into the, when you have, let me explain. Volcano happens, a lot of dust goes into the atmosphere. You actually reduce the amount of sunlight coming into the world. That reduces temperatures. Lots of volcanoes could help us tackle climate change. Now, when it happens, of course, there are all sorts of implications, and you change the weather in lots of places. So if we're going to start talking about purposefully putting dust and other things up into the atmosphere in order to reduce the amount of solar coming in, that is going to affect people. So we need a governance system. We need something sensible that will allow us to make choices about what of these technologies are actually going to work and which ones would have implications for others.
Great. I'll go back to the question, but just I can't hesitate. I can't stop myself from saying there's a difference between solar radiation management.
Yes, and no, absolutely. I was just wanting to cover both.
Let's pick up some other points there. Otherwise, I will threaten to go to my other, actually it's now 10. I think you've got quite a booming voice. Let's try it.
Thanks for your talk, Claire. I was just wondering, you said at the start that there are no trade-offs, and I wanted to push you on that.
Yeah, no, please do.
I'll just ask the question first.
I'm not saying there aren't trade-offs. There are trade-offs between, for example, if I was going to invest today in a school in Bangladesh, I could choose to build 3 schools, or I could choose to build a school that also acts as a cyclone shelter. So those are trade-offs. However, if you build 3 schools that then get blown away by the next cyclone, is that a trade-off? I don't think it is a trade-off. I think there is an issue about temporal preference that we need to tackle. When economists do analysis, they say, no, that is a trade-off because actually the returns you get for the school from having 3 schools before the cyclone comes through is better than having the 1 school, which is cyclone-proof and cyclone shelter. So the benefits are better to build the 3 schools. But actually, when you go and talk to poor people, they don't want 3 schools that are only going to be there for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. They want 1 school that operates even after the cyclone, because they won't get the government coming back to rebuild schools for another 10 years. So they'd rather have 1 school that lasts until they can next get a school. So this idea that economists have, that we all prefer lots of benefit today and we don't really care what happens tomorrow, is untrue in my experience of working with poor people around the world. It's very untrue when you work with communities in managing their natural resources. The communities in Nepal, when the government handed over their land that was meant to be forest to communities, they left it and protected it so that it could regrow. They've now got huge forests in which they're collecting timber. They made those choices at the time. It would have been, and according to the economists' analysis, better to let the goats carry on grazing the forest land. Those communities chose not to, and they did it right across Nepal. Nepal has now got large community forests that are producing a lot of timber and lots of value to the community. So this is a temporal issue. I don't think it's a real trade-off.
So I'm going to restrain myself again and just check.
Yes,
It was more just about like the choice of rhetorical strategy that environmental organisations often say, oh, the environment is the economy and you can't pursue one without pursuing the other. And I'm just wondering why you think it's strategically advantageous to take that approach rather than to say to the broader public, like, yeah, it will cost us a bit, and it clearly costs us $100 billion to meet all these targets, but we think that's a worthy trade-off, rather than saying it's not a trade-off at all. Because it seems like you did say that, like, we need all this money, it's just not the poor people who are paying, it's the rich people who are paying. So that seems like if you're asking rich countries to, like, send all this money to the poor world, it seems like a difficult sell to say, it's not a trade-off if you're like losing all this money, as opposed to saying it is a trade-off, but it's better.
Okay, so what I'm trying to explain is that when I say it's not a trade-off, it's because in the long term it's not a trade-off. It is a trade-off today if you use the analytical tools that we all use. But actually, even economists these days, and you know, Nick Stern, for example, I worked for him before he saw the light on climate change. I was with him working on the Commission for Africa process, which was just before he wrote the Stern report on climate change. And in that process, I spent my entire 2 years working with him, trying to persuade him to mention climate about Africa within the Commission for Africa, and failed completely because he saw it as a trade-off. A year later, damn him, he's writing the Stern report, and he worked out that actually this is all about discount rates. It's all about temporal preference. So it is a trade-off if you assume, as economists have for a very long time, that everyone prefers value today and they don't care about tomorrow. But ask yourself, do you care about what sort of world your children will inherit? And I think you'll probably find the answer is yes. So you do care about the future.
Let's move to further questions. And while I'm looking for hands, I can't just say that I wrote the back up on discount before the Stern review, so maybe I should take some credit. We've got one right up there.
Yeah, well done.
Yeah, first, thank you for your talk. My name is Logan. You spoke multiple times quite favorably of the role of subnational governments as well as businesses. And I wanted to ask, do you see their role as tangibly contributing to the physical reductions in emissions that we need? Or do you see it mostly as psychological, to have a bunch of smaller actors that galvanize public support to motivate national governments to come together? Or do you actually see them as emissions functionaries?
Sorry, I was struggling to hear. It's a question of whether it's a psychological thing or whether it actually makes a difference to the emissions?
Yeah.
Okay, so the majority of people work globally. The majority of people's jobs are not in big businesses. They're in small businesses. I can't remember the exact figures, but I think it's about 60% of the global population are in the informal sector, something like that. It's more than half anyway. So we need action happening at local levels because that's where most economic activity is happening. And that's why I mean, it's great that big business is doing this stuff, and big business has big impact because people like Unilever, who are amazing, by the way, I absolutely adore Unilever for all they're doing, are thinking about their supply chains all the way up to the farmer who's growing whatever that they're then going to use. And in thinking about that supply chain, they're actually going right back into that informal sector where most of the economic activity is happening. So it is really important. The levers within a country, federal governments don't have very many levers at the federal level. Well, it depends on the country, obviously, but the US is a really good example of actually it being more important that states take decisions than the federal government takes decisions. The efficiencies that we've seen improving in the car market in the US is because California, which is one of the largest markets for cars in the US, put a efficiency target on for cars. So all the manufacturers then thought, well, we're not going to make cars just for California that are different from the cars for the rest of the US. They just made it to the efficiency standard of California. So it matters.
I can tell it's a perfect leading question.
So I'm Dan Esty, a Rhodes Scholar of long ago, now a professor at Yale, and I have just returned to the university after 3 years running Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection and delivering exactly on this idea that a lot of the action is now at the state and local level as well as the business level. So in answer to Logan, one of the things we did in Connecticut was to launch a green bank that allowed a ramp up of 10-fold in the number of renewable energy projects being done in Connecticut and a ramp up of 8-fold in the amount of money being spent on energy efficiency. So I think the actual on-the-ground delivery of changed outcomes is happening at the state, local, and corporate levels, and therefore is important. But I'm going to push back, now that I have the microphone, on one thing in this presentation, which I would urge all of us to take on board over the next 2 days. And that is, this was a beautiful presentation to people who already care. And I would tell you what's hard is to pull in the people who don't care. And the conversation that I would urge us to think about, because I think in this room there will be some people that range on the spectrum, but all from care to care tremendously. The issue that I would ask is how do you bring Republicans in the United States and those who don't care across Europe into this conversation? And frankly, that's a much tougher discussion than some of the other things we'd like to have about how to do more with the resources that we have available. And I think the politics of this issue, again, speaking from the point of the United States, are terribly difficult. And it's a big issue in a place like Yale, where I teach, where people are all on the politically correct side of the conversation, and that is not where the solution is going to come from. The solution is going to come from figuring out how do you bring the marginal hostile party to come together with you. So again, just in the spirit of pushing back and making this a serious dialogue about the tough issues, I would urge we keep that in mind over the next 48 hours.
Completely agree. I'll just say that I worked as a civil servant in the UK government for 15 years, in which only 8 of those were we actually talking about climate explicitly. The rest of the time I was working on climate change. I just didn't say that I was working on climate change. I said I was working on energy efficiency, energy security, water security, food security.
Great, yes, good question. I was just about to say we've had a predominance of male questions, so your hand should have come up to the finish.
Hi, I'm Mayanka. Thank you for the talk. I just want to ask you, in terms of making certain distinctions between poor countries and rich countries, knowing how many kind of like multinational corporations you have setting up in poorer countries within, say, special economic zones and having much more liberties with doing what they do, or having a lot of waste from the first world being dumped into other countries in terms of second-hand good markets, and then their destruction creating further damage in these poorer countries. I'm just wondering how we begin to think of regulations when we know there's so much of cross-national willing and unwilling movement of objects and people taking place.
It's an easy question for you.
Yeah, it comes back to this issue of transparency. I mean, the opportunities these days are completely different than they used to be to really improve the accountability of businesses, the accountability of governments for the action that they take, because social media just allows us to be in touch. It's a problem also. Social media is a bubble. I have deliberately following climate deniers on my Twitter account. I need to know what they're thinking about. But it's also an opportunity that when you see something terrible happening, you can go to Avaz or to 38 Degrees and start a campaign about something. And it's really important that we are all becoming more and more political activists, basically, and trying to get society to shift in the way that it has to as fast as we can. So the other thing, actually, I would say to that is within most countries, MPs receive very few letters that are not generated by an NGO's campaign. Every time you have an issue, write to your bloody MP, because they act, they care, they notice, and then they raise it in Parliament, and that changes the way that governments work. The more you write, the more active. There is somebody that I was working with when I was, he was a lecturer when I was a student here at Oxford, who told me, you have to write a letter a week. Write a letter a week. Become the thorn in your MP's side for the change you want to see in your area.
Fantastic. We've got time for one or two more questions. There's a hand. You have two hands here. There's tables one at the front before we wrap up.
Thanks so much for your talk. I wanted to talk more about informal sector and small businesses, as well as the personal choice that people in middle to high income countries have to make. So, for example, the personal choice of flying. What are the accountability structures for small businesses or people in the informal sector, as well as for changing consumer habits from just people who care about climate change to say everyone? Will this come top down from governments or local, quasi-local governments, or do you see a mixture of kind of government, technology, and consumer bargaining power per se?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of the levers that government have, taxes and so on, to encourage the sort of behaviour you want and tax the sort of behaviour you don't want. There are all sorts of things that can be done. They'll only happen if everyone wants them to happen. So we need to get that groundswell. But that's at the moment, when you talk to Paul Polman, the head of Unilever, and IKEA, another great example of a company who's really transformed. Why did they transform? They transformed because they believe their consumers want them to transform. They believe that people that shop at IKEA want to know that the products that they're buying are bought through a very responsible sourcing practice that actually supports the poor people that are growing the cotton that they then use in their curtains or whatever. So it's because the big businesses are moving because they do believe that people care. We now just, if you get enough of that sense of the consumer's care, then small businesses will also, in order to stay in business, have to respond as well. But it is also about taxes and, the usual government levers.
Okay, great. And last one.
Thank you for your talk. I'm Harsha. My question is about the accountability mechanism. I think with the onset of the new NDCs, what do you see in the coming years as sort of a monitoring mechanisms for countries, especially to compare each other's NDCs? Because it also draws into the idea of national sovereignty, which a lot of the bigger countries like India and China are sort of playing into, not wanting to have third-party mechanisms for monitoring. So how do you sort of see that environment evolving with countries keeping up their commitments, but also not sort of defaulting on what they've committed?
Yeah, so I absolutely do not believe that there is any way that we will internationally form a police force that will force governments to do what they said that they would do. I mean, when Kyoto was agreed, there was a sort of sense that there will be some sort of issue if countries don't do what they do, but in fact there wasn't. Canada just walked away, Australia just walked. Did Australia walk away? I can't now remember. Anyway, lost in the midst of time. Lots of things happened that weren't good. Nobody really did anything about it. The only thing that matters is if your own people are telling you that it matters. And it's kind of difficult in Modi's India. It's a bit difficult in China, which isn't very good at sort of listening to its people. But the better levers possibly for India and China at the moment is this sense that they want to be part of the good guys. They want to be part of the group of the poorest countries that are doing the right things. So I think that's my analysis. I mean, we're doing quite a lot of sort of geopolitical analysis at the moment to try and work out what the levers and things are. But the two essential components are keep the poorest countries being very ambitious, because that'll drag the rest of the world. If the poorest countries of the world are acting, then how can the richest countries not act? It's very difficult in the sort of, your sense of your own international identity if you're being seen to be behind. And secondly, to really try and get these subnational accountability mechanisms working, and then try and get the language of climate change simplified so people can actually understand what we're talking about. And they don't think that 1.5 sounds like a good idea because it'll be a warmer summer.
Right. Well, Claire, look, thank you very much for an incredibly wide-ranging talk. really and thoroughly provocative, I have to say. I've been completely provoked by your talk, and I'm sure many of you have as well. I'm sure Claire would join me in thanking you for a good set of challenges, a good set of questions, and overall a great opening discussion. So thank you very much.
Great.